Some stories don't shout. They whisper. They wait. They sit in the back row with a notebook and a calm stare. A hungry boy is dragged into court. A judge hands down punishment like it's routine. And a woman older, quiet, invisible rises without a word. He thought she didn't belong. He told her to get out. He never asked who she was. He should have, because she wasn't a visitor. She wasn't an activist. She was sent to investigate him. Now the courtroom that silenced her is about to hear her speak, not with anger, not with noise, but with the full weight of the truth. Justice didn't come in shouting. It came in silence. And it's standing right in front of him. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Let's begin. It was 8:57 a.m. when she pushed open the side door of the courthouse, the kind that creaked just enough to announce someone not meant to be noticed. The hallway inside smelled like coffee gone cold and old carpet cleaner, and somewhere down the corridor a clerk's heels clicked unevenly against the tile like a metronome trying to find the right rhythm. Celeste Munro didn't rush. She walked with the quiet certainty of someone who'd entered hundreds of buildings like this before, but never one that felt quite like this, tight with something unsaid, like a room where no one had exhaled in a while. Her steps were soft, deliberate. Her navy coat fell just past her knees, sleeves, buttoned pockets empty, except for a small black notebook held firmly in her left hand. The courtroom door read 4C in faded brass, the kind of detail no one ever polished because no one ever cared. She entered as the last of the attorneys were settling into their chairs, their voices low but sharp papers fluttering in the air like restless birds. She chose the third row from the back, not too close to stand out, not too far to miss anything. Her eyes scanned the room, the tired bailiff adjusting his belt, the public defender whispering to a client with the urgency of someone who'd run out of time, and the defendant, a young man no older than her grandson, fidgeting in a suit too, tight at the shoulders. At the front, the bench still sat empty. Above it, the flag hung stiffly unmoved by the ceiling vent that hummed without conviction. The moment the door behind the bench opened, the room shifted like a ripple through still water. "All rise," the bailiff called out, but the voice lacked strength, as if even he had stopped believing in the ritual. Judge Harlan Givens entered like a man who'd ruled over too many mornings just like this one, his black robe swinging like a curtain too heavy for the stage. His face was unreadable, jaw-tight eyes, half-lidded, not from sleep but from boredom or maybe something worse, certainty. He didn't scan the room so much as absorb it with a glance, then sat without a word, as if commanding silence was the only real thing he still enjoyed. The first case was called. A young black man charged with resisting arrest. His wrists were still red from handcuffs, his lawyer barely old enough to rent a car. She began to speak something about lack of probable cause, about excessive force, but Givens waved her off before she could finish. "Save it," he said, voice like gravel. "This isn't a seminar." No one flinched. Not the jury, not the defendant, not even the lawyer, who simply closed her mouth like it was muscle memory. Only Celeste moved just slightly, lowering her eyes to the notebook and writing one clean line across the top of the page. It was a quiet motion, but not a hidden one. The judge noticed. His eyes narrowed. He squinted as if trying to remember whether he'd seen her before or just sensed her wasn't part of the script. "You there," he said, sharply pointing toward the gallery. "Blue coat, what are you doing?" The courtroom paused. Heads turned not in curiosity, but with the kind of communal tension that happens when someone pokes at still water. Celeste looked up, her voice, even calm. "Just observing, Your Honor." She didn't smile, didn't blink, just met his gaze like a question she had already answered in her mind. He didn't like that. "This isn't a classroom," he snapped. "And I don't need activists scribbling notes like I'm giving a TED Talk." The words weren't loud, but they carried sharp enough to draw an uncomfortable cough from someone near the back. "There's a park across the street if you want to protest," he added. "This is a court of law." Celeste closed the notebook gently, not from fear, not even from anger, but from something older and deeper, resolve. "Understood," she said simply, and rose from the bench without another word. She walked to the exit with her shoulders straight and her pace unbroken, each step soft enough to go unnoticed, yet loud enough to echo through the bones of the room. No one stopped her. No one spoke. Even the young man on trial watched her go, his eyes lingering on the door long after it shut behind her, as if part of him had gone with her hope, maybe, or just the idea that someone had cared enough to stay if only for a moment. The judge tapped his gavel once. "Let's move on," he muttered, but his voice faltered ever so slightly, and for the rest of that morning he kept glancing at the third row like a shadow had stayed behind. Outside, the air felt warmer than it should have been. The sky was pale and wide and open, in a way the courtroom never was. Celeste didn't look back. She never did. The hallway echoed differently now, her steps the only sound, until she reached the lobby and stepped into the light. She wasn't surprised by the judge's reaction. She'd been told to leave rooms like that before, told she didn't belong, told to wait her turn, told to smile when nothing was funny. But this time she hadn't come to be seen. She had come to see, and in those short minutes she had seen enough. Not just the boy in the defendant's chair, or the tired clerk pretending not to hear, or the public defender already thinking about the next hopeless case, but the man behind the bench, and the weight of his indifference, and the way he wielded it like a weapon without ever lifting his voice. No, this wasn't about being embarrassed or dismissed. It wasn't even about being judged. This was about judgment itself. And Celeste Monroe wasn't done watching. Not even close. The office was tucked away above an old tax service storefront, the kind with peeling letters on the window, and a bell over the door that rang 2 seconds too late. Inside, the walls were bare, except for a single corkboard pinned with old case numbers, scribbled notes, and a photo of a missing girl someone had taped there years ago and forgotten to take down. Celeste Monroe sat behind a desk that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, her coat draped over the chair, back her notebook resting neatly beside a battered laptop and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched since sunrise. The blinds were half open, letting in a fractured strip of morning light that slanted across the floor like a line she hadn't crossed yet. Her phone buzzed once, then went silent, the name flashing on the screen for just a second before disappearing. Someone from D.C. Someone with clearance. Someone who wouldn't call unless it mattered. She didn't answer. Not yet. Instead, she opened the drawer to her right and pulled out a manila folder marked in careful black ink, Rashad Bennett, age 15. Inside, a copy of the police report, a school file with too many absences and too few notes, and one grainy photo of a boy with round cheeks and wary eyes, the kind of look that said he'd learned early not to expect kindness. He'd been caught stealing 2 granola bars and a can of soup from a corner store during a citywide blackout, and even though the store owner never pressed charges, the responding officer had decided to set an example. The report was thin. No mention of a guardian, no context, no background, but the charges stuck, and Judge Harlan Givens had handed down a 6-month juvenile detention sentence in under 12 minutes. Celeste read it all again, line by line, not because she hadn't memorized it already, but because there was something about repetition that made disbelief settle deeper into her bones. She could still hear the tone in the judge's voice from that morning in court, measured, dismissive, final. She'd heard that tone before across benches and podiums in meetings, where her voice was the only one not being taken seriously, in courtrooms where silence was expected unless you wore a robe or carried a badge. And that tone, more than the words, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about theft. This wasn't about justice. This was about who gets the benefit of the doubt and who doesn't even get the time of day. She reached for her coffee, took one sip, grimaced, and pushed it aside. Then she turned toward the second folder, thicker, heavier, years in the making. Inside were printed transcripts from past rulings, most of them cases where Judge Givens had presided, and all of them flagged for patterns of concern. 12 black minors sentenced without parole options, 9 cases where mitigating evidence was dismissed without hearing, and 5 incidents where officers accused of excessive force were cleared before the ink on the report had even dried. She'd seen these patterns before, scattered across different towns buried in legalese, but here in this county they were almost proud in their consistency. Celeste stood and crossed the room to the window, looking down at the slow-moving street below, the people passing, without knowing their lives could be decided in rooms like the one she'd just left. A delivery driver leaned against his truck, scrolling through his phone, while a mother tugged gently at her child's backpack as they hurried toward a late bus. Normal scenes, ordinary lives, but Celeste had lived long enough to know that the line between ordinary and broken was thinner than most people believed. A single sentence from a tired judge, a lazy assumption, a file overlooked, and suddenly someone's whole future shifted like a house knocked off its foundation by a storm you never saw coming. She exhaled the kind of breath that carried years with it, then turned back toward her desk. The badge on the cabinet caught the light gold official etched with the seal of the Department of Civil Judicial Oversight, but she hadn't worn it to court that morning. That wasn't her style anymore. Once, maybe when she was younger, she'd led with her title, let the credentials do the talking, but these days she'd learned something quieter, something deeper. Real power doesn't need to announce itself. It just waits, listens, watches, and when the time is right, it moves. Her phone buzzed again. This time she picked it up. Celeste came the voice on the other end, clipped and low. "You saw it." She nodded, even though they couldn't see her. "I saw enough," she said. "It's worse than the file suggested." A pause, then a sigh. That judge has been on the bench 18 years. He's insulated. Press coverage is minimal, and the state board's been hands-off for a decade. Celeste let the silence stretch before she answered. "Not anymore." She ended the call and slid the folder back into the drawer, then sat down and opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing notes, timestamps, courtroom behaviors, inconsistencies in process. She wasn't gathering data. She was building a case, and if history had taught her anything, it was that the most dangerous people were never the ones who shouted. They were the ones who smiled as they signed lives away, believing no one would ever come knocking. Well, she was knocking now. Not with anger, not with vengeance. Just with the quiet, steady hand of someone who'd seen too much, lost too many, and decided that silence wasn't safety, it was surrender. And Celeste Monroe didn't come here to surrender. The hallway behind the records room was always colder after hours, as if the air itself knew it wasn't supposed to be breathed in without supervision. Celeste Monroe walked slowly, her footsteps quiet but purposeful, the soles of her shoes barely brushing the tile, as she passed the long wall of framed portraits, judges, and clerks. From another time, their smiles brittle under fluorescent light. The building had emptied out by now, save for the occasional hum of an old vending machine or the metallic click of the security door locking somewhere out of sight. Every sound seemed louder in the hush, but Celeste didn't flinch. She'd walked down hallways like this before long, silent, lined with history and secrets, always knowing that what waited at the end was never just a person but a choice. The door to the records room stood slightly ajar, and just inside a thin woman in a faded gray cardigan sat on a wooden chair that looked like it had been dragged in from another office. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and her eyes darted to the doorway the moment Celeste stepped through, wide and anxious like a bird that had learned to fear its own reflection. "You came," the woman whispered, "not quite a question, not quite a welcome." Celeste gave a slow nod, closing the door behind her without turning the knob too fast, careful not to startle either of them. "I don't know your name," the woman said, voice hushed but urgent, "and I don't want to know it. I just needed to do something." She stood up, then reaching into the side pocket of her cardigan, her fingers trembling slightly as she pulled out a small flash drive. No label, no tag, just a sliver of silver and plastic that could ruin a career or protect a dozen lives, depending on who held it. "This has copies of docket edits," she said, unofficial notes. Judge Givens asked to be typed into the margins, then removed from the public versions. Her eyes dropped. "I kept them. Not because I planned to, but because I couldn't forget what they said." Celeste stepped forward, slowly, extending her hand without pressure. The woman didn't place the drive in her palm immediately. She stared at it for a long second, as if asking it to forgive her, then finally let go. Their fingers brushed just slightly. Celeste felt the chill in her skin, the kind that didn't come from air conditioning but from fear long held in silence. "What's your name?" Celeste asked gently, not pressing, only offering space. The woman hesitated. "Joan," she said at last. "Joan Wells. 17 years in this courthouse. I've seen enough to know when something's wrong, and I've seen enough to know when no one's going to fix it." Her voice cracked on the last few words, but she didn't cry. She'd passed that threshold a long time ago. Celeste nodded slowly, slipping the flash drive into her coat pocket with quiet precision, not saying thank you because this wasn't a favor, it was a fracture in the wall. "You didn't have to do this," she said, instead letting the weight of that truth hang between them. Joan looked at her eyes, bloodshot but steady. "No," she said, "but I couldn't not do it either." She stepped back toward her chair and sat down slowly, like her legs had finally remembered how tired they were. "Please don't tell anyone we met," she added. "I still need this job. I've got 2 more years until my pension, and this place doesn't forgive people who speak." Celeste lowered her eyes, absorbing the cost of truth whispered in basements and break rooms, the way justice sometimes had to be smuggled through side doors because the front ones had long stopped letting it in. "I understand," she said softly. "More than you know." For a moment neither of them moved. Outside, a floor buffer hummed faintly down the hallway, mechanical and distant. Somewhere far above them, a pipe groaned the building, settling into its bones. Then Celeste stood again, adjusting the collar of her coat and glancing once toward the closed door. "Joan," she said, pausing just long enough for the name to mean something. "This matters. What you did tonight, it matters." Joan didn't reply, but her shoulders eased just slightly, and her hands loosened in her lap like maybe for the first time in a while she didn't feel like she was holding up the ceiling alone. Celeste left without another word, her footsteps just as soft as before, but now there was something different in the way she moved, more sure, more settled, as if one more piece of the puzzle had finally clicked into place. When she stepped back into the main corridor, the light above her flickered once, then steadied, casting her shadow long and quiet against the wall. She didn't check over her shoulder. She didn't need to. By the time she reached the exit, the air outside felt heavier, like the city itself was waiting for something to shift. The sky had darkened into a dull gray blue, and streetlights buzzed faintly in the distance, painting the sidewalk in streaks of orange and gold. She looked up just for a second at the courthouse looming behind her stone, silent, unmoved by everything it had seen, and then turned away, walking back into the night with her hands in her pockets and her thoughts already somewhere deeper. The flash drive pressed against her side with every step, not heavy, not sharp, just there, a quiet weight with too many stories tucked inside. Celeste didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had what she came for. And now someone else would have to explain why those files existed in the first place. The coffee shop sat at the edge of downtown, tucked between a closed-down barber shop and a florist that never opened before noon. The kind of place where the chairs creaked a little when you leaned back, and the baristas didn't ask your name unless you gave it twice. Celeste chose the far corner facing the window, not because she wanted the light, but because it let her see everyone who walked in without turning her head. She stirred her coffee slowly, not really tasting it, just moving it in slow circles like she was trying to settle something inside herself. The morning was gray, the kind of gray that seemed to seep into your thoughts if you let it, and her fingers tightened slightly around the ceramic cup each time the bell above the door jingled. He walked in 10 minutes late, but she hadn't expected him to be on time. Alan Reyes still wore the same beige trench coat he'd favored back in law school, only now it hung heavier, the collar limp, the fabric more wrinkle than thread. His face was leaner than she remembered his beard, speckled with gray, but the way he scanned the room told her he still didn't like surprises. When he spotted her, his mouth pulled into the kind of half-smile people wear when they're not sure whether to apologize or pretend nothing happened. "You always did like the seat with the view," he said, sliding into the chair across from her without waiting for an invitation. She studied him for a second before replying, her tone even but not cold. "You always did hate being watched." He shrugged, pulled off his coat, and folded it neatly across his lap like he needed something to do with his hands. "You called," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "That's rare." Celeste nodded once. "It's not a social visit." Alan leaned back, arms crossed, waiting. "I need someone who knows how Givens works behind closed doors. Someone who's seen how far he'll go when no one's paying attention." His eyes darkened just a little, the smile fading. "And you thought of me." She met his gaze. "You used to fight him in court. You saw what others pretended not to." He exhaled slowly, then looked away toward the window where a city bus pulled to the curb brakes, sighing, passengers shifting. "That was a long time ago, Celeste. I'm not that guy anymore." She didn't respond right away. She just let the silence stretch long enough to feel honest. "I know you're not," she said finally, "but you were." And that still counts for something. Alan tapped a finger on the edge of the table, the rhythm uneven. "You want me to go on record?" She didn't blink. "I want the truth." He looked down, his voice dropping. "The truth costs more than I'm willing to pay." The words weren't bitter. They were tired. They belonged to a man who'd already measured the distance between principle and survival and chosen which side to stand on. "I've got twins," he said quietly. "Mortgage. Clients who hire me because I don't make headlines. You think I don't care I've watched?" Givens throw lives away like they were wrappers on his lunch tray. But saying that out loud, tying my name to it, means burning everything I've built. Celeste nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in understanding. She'd seen it too many times before, people who wanted to help, who knew they should, but lived in a world where doing the right thing came with a price tag too steep to bear. She looked at him not with disappointment but with something softer, something like grief. "Then you've already answered," she said. "I didn't come to guilt you. I came to ask, and you gave me your answer." Alan looked up, the regret already forming in the lines around his eyes. "You still going to take him on?" She held his gaze steady. "I already started." For a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, the bus hissed and pulled away. The florist next door unlocked its gate with a screech that echoed faintly through the window. The world kept moving, indifferent to all the things that broke quietly inside its people. "I hope you're careful," Alan said after a pause. "That man's not just cruel. He's connected." Celeste let out a soft breath through her nose, not a laugh, but something close. "Cruel men always are." She pushed her chair back, stood slowly, and reached for her coat. "Take care of your daughters," she said. "And if the time ever comes when you decide silence costs more than truth, you know where to find me." Alan didn't stand. He just watched her go, watched the way she walked, with a steadiness that made the floor feel more solid, like her footsteps were pressing something into the ground behind her. The bell above the door chimed once more as it swung shut, and for a long minute he just sat there, staring into the last swirl of steam rising from her untouched coffee, wondering what it said about him that he still hadn't taken a sip. The courthouse lobby looked the same, but it didn't feel the same, not to Celeste, not anymore. The fluorescent lights still buzzed faintly overhead, the security scanner still beeped for every set of keys and belt buckle, and the front desk clerk still didn't look up unless someone asked twice. But today there was something else in the air, something denser, quieter, like a held breath stretched across too many walls. Celeste walked through the front doors just past 8:30, not rushing, not hiding her steps, steady on the polished tile floor that seemed louder now with every heel click she made. She wore a charcoal gray suit, sharply pressed, and her coat was open just enough to reveal the gold badge hanging on a lanyard around her neck, small, official, unmistakable. People noticed. They always did when someone entered a room, as if they already belonged in it. A clerk at the filing station paused mid-stamp, her hand frozen in the air for half a beat longer than natural. One of the court officers whispered something to his partner, nodding toward Celeste as she passed. A young paralegal leaned in to ask her colleague, "Who is that?" And the answer came quiet, low, the kind of whisper that carried faster than a shout. "That's her. The one from D.C." Celeste didn't slow down. She didn't need to. She knew exactly where she was going, and this time she wasn't entering from the back door or taking a seat in the shadows. Courtroom 4C hadn't changed since she was last there, but everything about how she moved through it had. She took the same seat, third row aisle side, but this time no one turned around to ask who she was. They already knew. Or if they didn't, they could read it on the badge that rested against her chest, shining dully under the flickering overhead light. The judge hadn't arrived yet, but the tension in the room already had. A defense attorney flipped nervously through her notes. A bailiff adjusted his posture twice in the span of 30 seconds. Even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard more than usual. And then the door opened. All rise came the call, firm but thin, as if even the bailiff wasn't sure what kind of morning this was going to be. Judge Harlan Givens entered with the same robe, the same measured pace, the same expression of resigned authority, but something in his eyes faltered the moment they landed on her. He didn't stop walking. He didn't speak. But the stiffness in his shoulders betrayed the part of him that now realized this wasn't going to be routine. He took his seat, cleared his throat, and tapped his gavel once. "Let's proceed," he said. But the words came out with a hitch. a barely perceptible crack that only someone like Celeste would catch. The first case was a civil complaint, nothing controversial, nothing loud, but Judge Givens moved through it faster than usual. His words clipped his tone thinner. He avoided looking at her directly, but his eyes flicked toward the gallery between each pause, each transition, like he couldn't help checking whether she was still there. She didn't flinch. She just took notes, calm and deliberate, the pen moving with the precision of someone who had trained herself to listen more deeply than most people speak. During a recess, he glanced at her again, then spoke into the silence. "Miss Monroe," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "If you're here in any official capacity, I trust you've coordinated with the court." Celeste closed her notebook, slowly lifting her gaze with a quiet steadiness that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. "I'm simply observing, Your Honor," she said. "You made it clear this courtroom isn't for activists. I assume it still welcomes oversight." A beat past 2 seconds stretched into a quiet tension that felt louder than anything spoken. Givens gave a tight smile, the kind that didn't touch his eyes. "Of course, we have nothing to hide," but his hand resting on the edge of the bench tightened just slightly, the knuckles whitening for half a breath before he let go. The rest of the morning passed like that. Cases, read motions, filed names called, but the atmosphere never quite returned to normal. One attorney stumbled over her introduction, distracted by the presence in the third row. Another paused mid-argument when the judge cut him off abruptly, the dismissal sharper than usual, as if Givens was trying to reassert control. He could feel slipping grain by grain through his fingers. By noon, he called for an early recess. "Lunch break 90 minutes," he said, already halfway out of his chair before finishing the sentence. He moved quickly, almost too quickly, catching his water glass with the edge of his robe and barely saving it from tipping. Then he was gone, disappearing through the side door like a man trying not to look over his shoulder even as he felt every pair of eyes burning quietly into his back. Celeste didn't move right away. She stayed seated for a long moment after he left, her hands still folded over her notebook, her breathing even unhurried. Then she stood, adjusted the badge around her neck, and walked out of the courtroom the same way she had entered, unshaken, steady, leaving behind only the quiet hum of whispers and the heavy awareness that something had shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, but definitively. She didn't need to say it out loud. The message was already written in the way the room had bent around her presence. She wasn't chasing him. She was waiting. And he was starting to understand that. The office smelled of dust and lemon polish, the kind that clung to old wooden desks and faded linoleum floors, the kind that suggested someone had tried to make it clean, even if it would never feel new. Celeste sat at her desk in the late afternoon. Hush, the sun drifting low across the window blinds, casting sharp, uneven lines across the surface, where her files lay in quiet formation. She had pulled the shades halfway, not to block the light, but to see the lines it cast, to remind herself that truth, like sunlight, had a way of finding its way through the slats, no matter how tightly you tried to keep it out. On the desk before her sat 12 manila folders, each one marked in her hand, each one a life measured, judged, and more often than not discarded by the man in the robe. She picked up the first, opened it carefully, and began to read aloud, not for anyone else, just for herself, just to remember that these were not statistics, not exhibits, but people with names and birthdays and voices that had been drowned out beneath procedure. Jared Lucas, 17, first offense caught with marijuana, judge, denied diversion program, sentenced to 8 months juvenile detention. She didn't speak with outrage. She spoke like someone reading a eulogy no one had stayed to hear. Then the next. Alana Green, 16, expelled from school for truancy, arrested for trespassing on campus. No legal representation, judge, sentenced her to 6 months in a group home. Motion to reconsider denied. Her voice was steady, but something behind her sternum pulled tight with every case. A quiet tension she knew too well, one that didn't burn anymore but weighed. She moved through the folders, slowly, hands gliding across paper worn soft at the edges, her notes annotated in margins with clean black ink. No prior evidence dismissed without hearing defendant underage, no guardian present. Patterns. They weren't just in the rulings. They were in the silences between them, in the way certain voices had been erased before they even had the chance to speak. She paused over the file of a boy named Marcus Lott, 14 years old, caught sleeping in an abandoned car behind a supermarket. He wasn't stealing, wasn't hiding, wasn't violent, just cold, alone, and tired. The store clerk hadn't filed a complaint. The responding officers had left it vague, but the judge had called him a delinquent in the making and sentenced him to 4 months in juvenile holding without community review. 4 months, Celeste whispered, barely above breath, as if speaking louder would betray something sacred, for being homeless. Her fingers lingered on the corner of the report, as if she could rewrite it through touch alone. She leaned back, closed her eyes for a moment, and let the weight of it all settle around her, not just the cases, but the deeper knowledge that every one of these decisions had built a wall brick by brick around the idea that justice was supposed to mean fairness. Givens hadn't used, slurs hadn't shouted in his courtroom, hadn't made headlines he didn't need to. His power was in the quiet choices, the legal dismissals, the shrugs cloaked in judicial language that no one challenged, because challenging it meant stepping outside the lines drawn by tradition and tenure. A low hum of traffic filtered in from the street below, punctuated by the occasional chirp of a crosswalk signal or the rattle of a delivery truck passing by. Normal city noise, normal life, the kind of sounds people expect when nothing is wrong. But in this room with these files, it felt like the outside world didn't quite apply. Celeste reopened the folder marked Rashad Bennett. She read the sentencing remarks again, underlined one particular sentence, and wrote a note beside it. In small, controlled print, judge cited lack of remorse. Child was not given opportunity to speak. Her pen hovered mid-air as she remembered the look on the boy's face in court, how his hands trembled, even though he tried to keep them still, how his public defender had barely had time to whisper before the ruling had dropped like a curtain. It wasn't just about that day. It was about the unbroken chain of days before it: school suspensions, housing instability, missed meals, and the days that would follow, now reshaped by one man's perception of order. She picked up the final folder and opened it slowly. Inside were photos from a juvenile holding facility, empty beds, barred windows, a gray recreation room with no books, no color, no sound. Beneath it, a transcript from a hearing where Judge Givens had said, "Sometimes it's better they get structure now rather than freedom they don't know how to use." Celeste stared at that sentence until her vision blurred, not from tears, but from something deeper, a kind of sorrow, so steady it no longer broke the surface, just lived underneath it. She stood, walked to the file cabinet in the corner, and carefully slid each folder into the drawer in order. When she closed it, the latch clicked softly like punctuation on a sentence no one had wanted to hear. Then she turned back to her desk, reached for a clean notepad, and began drafting a preliminary report. Summary: names, dates, judicial inconsistencies, pattern language, no drama, no color, just the truth lined up and quietly devastating. She paused once halfway through a sentence and looked toward the window. The light was fading now, golden and fractured, painting the floor with long stripes that reminded her of courtroom pews, empty and still. Somewhere behind her, a radiator kicked on with a groan. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. The system was already creaking. All she had to do now was keep pushing quietly, steadily, until it cracked wide enough for someone else to see. The hallway leading to the conference suite was quiet, in a way that made even soft footsteps feel intrusive, as if the air itself had thickened with expectation. Celeste walked with her usual steady rhythm, her heels making measured contact with the marble floor, her badge tucked just beneath the lapel of her blazer resting against her chest like a silent anchor. A court officer led the way, saying nothing, glancing back only once, with a nervous half-nod that didn't quite rise to the level of acknowledgement. They passed closed doors and framed certificates, past rows of chairs. No one had sat in for years until they reached a side room no larger than a modest dining area lit by overhead fluorescence that hummed like an old television left on mute. Inside, the space was deliberately plain white walls, no windows, one rectangular table, 6 chairs, and not a single personal touch to distract from the business at hand. Celeste was already seated when Judge Harlan Givens walked in the door, clicking softly shut behind him. He didn't greet her, didn't look surprised, but something in the way he hesitated before pulling out the chair across from her betrayed the tension he was trying to conceal. She didn't stand. She didn't offer her hand. She simply sat still, a closed folder laid neatly on the table between them, her fingers gently resting on the edges like someone guarding a truth too long ignored. He took his seat slowly, the wooden legs creaking under his weight, and leaned back just enough to feign comfort. "I wasn't informed of any formal inquiry," he said, his voice carefully neutral, the kind of tone a man uses when he wants to sound unbothered, but is already calculating what went wrong. "That was intentional," Celeste replied calmly, not unkindly, just firm in the way someone is when they know the facts are already stacked in their favor. He raised an eyebrow, his eyes scanning her face for a flicker of doubt, but all he found was stillness. "You could have introduced yourself in court," he said, attempting a mild accusation wrapped in feigned civility. Celeste met his gaze without blinking. "I did," she answered plainly. "You told me to leave." Her voice didn't rise. She didn't rush. She let the words fall where they belonged, one after another, like stones marking a trail she had already walked. Then she slid the manila folder across the table, slow and deliberate, and sat back, folding her hands in her lap. He opened it without comment. Inside were transcripts, hearing summaries, court orders, and 3 signed affidavits, one from a former court clerk, one from a public defender, and one that made him pause when he read the name, a retired prosecutor he'd once called a friend. "You've been compiling this," he muttered, eyes still on the pages, though his voice had dropped just enough to betray the truth. He knew what it meant. Celeste didn't nod. She didn't confirm. She simply waited, letting the weight of the documentation speak louder than any argument. So he said, finally closing the folder but keeping one hand on top of it as if contact alone might still give him control. "What's the endgame? You want an apology, a resignation?" Celeste shook her head slightly. "This isn't about theatrics," she said. "This is about accountability." The word lingered in the room, floating in the space between their chairs, like a third presence neither of them could ignore. He leaned back further, arms now folded across his chest, the defensive posture of a man who had spent too many years convinced of his own immunity. "You have no idea the pressure we're under," he said, the practiced deflection falling from his lips with mechanical ease. "The backlog, the media, the public demanding justice in headlines, not in law." Celeste tilted her head, her expression unchanged. "You're right," she replied. "I don't know your pressures. But I know this." She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a small monitor, and set it on the table. With a press of her thumb, the screen flickered to life, playing silent courtroom footage from 2 years earlier. A young black boy on the witness stand, his hands clasped tightly, voice barely audible. Judge Givens leaning forward, expression sharp mouth, moving with force. There was no audio, but the scene didn't need it, body language said enough. "You called him street trash," Celeste said quietly. "It's in the transcript. He was 14. Givens stared at the screen, then looked away, jaw tightening. "You destroyed his credibility," she continued. "Not with facts, but with your assumptions. Because of how he spoke. Because of how he looked." Silence followed, thick and motionless. Celeste didn't press. She didn't attack. She gave him space to sit with what he'd done, not to shame him, but to remind him that justice once forgotten doesn't dissolve, it waits. "We all have biases," she said finally. "But when you sit on that bench, they don't just exist. They echo." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't accuse. It simply held the weight of truth delivered with grace. Givens didn't respond. His eyes drifted back to the closed folder, hands now still, fingers curled slightly against the table, like someone unsure whether to hold on or let go. "This isn't personal," Celeste said. "I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here because that bench doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people, all of them." And in that moment, the man who had spent decades ruling from behind a gavel sat without one, just a citizen now facing the consequences of decisions made without thought for the stories behind the names. Celeste stood slowly, gathering her things with quiet care, offering no judgment, no parting blow, just presence. "You'll hear from oversight soon," she said, her tone soft but final. Then she walked to the door and left him sitting there, surrounded by evidence, memory, and silence, the kind that doesn't end an argument but begins a reckoning. The file sat on the table like it had weight, beyond paper, its manila edges softened from being handled, too many times opened and closed like a wound someone couldn't quite let heal. Celeste didn't touch it right away. She let it sit there, in the quiet, her eyes lingering on the name printed neatly across the top, in bold institutional type, Rashad Bennett, 15. Outside the window, the sun had just begun its slow descent, casting that warm amber light that made even the dust in the air seem gentle. But the weight inside the room wasn't softened by it. Not this time. She reached for the folder and opened it slowly, careful not to rush past anything. The first page was his intake photo shoulders, too square for someone his age, jaw set in a way that told you he was trying to be brave, but the eyes gave it away. They always did. That's what made her pause just for a second. Not the numbers, not the charge, but the expression of a child who already knew that people didn't expect much from him, who had already heard it enough to believe it. She turned the page. The incident report was only half a page long. He'd been stopped behind a corner store during a blackout, caught with a can of soup, a small bag of chips, and a bottle of water. Total value, maybe $5. The store owner didn't press charges, didn't even want a report, said the boy looked scared, not dangerous, said he would have just let him go if the patrol car hadn't pulled up. But the officers made the arrest anyway, protocol, they said, and by the time Rashad's name entered the system, the story had already begun to write itself without him. Celeste ran her thumb along the margin of the page, where she'd written her own note in neat slanted script. No prior offenses, no legal guardian present at hearing, no statement recorded from defendant. The hearing transcript wasn't much longer. The defense attorney had tried to request counseling and community service, citing Rashad's age and the absence of any criminal record. But Judge Givens had interrupted the motion, calling it naive and soft. Then came the phrase, short, cold, dismissive, the one that had followed Celeste for days since she first read it. Another repeat in the making. She whispered it now just to hear the weight of it out loud. A repeat in the making. It didn't sound like a sentence. It sounded like a prophecy delivered by someone who'd stopped looking for anything beneath the surface. Her hand moved instinctively to the side of the desk, reaching for her pen. She circled the phrase, drew a line to the margin, and wrote beneath it, "What does hunger look like to a man in a robe?" The deeper she dug into Rashad's file, the clearer the picture became, not of a criminal, but of a child swallowed by a system that had no patience for backstory, no interest in questions that required compassion. He lived with his older sister in a one-bedroom apartment 2 bus routes from school. Their electricity had been shut off for the second time that month. He had been suspended twice for being late, once for falling asleep in class. He hadn't missed school because he didn't care. He missed it because he was tired, because his stomach ached, because he didn't want to admit he had nothing in his backpack except a spiral notebook and a broken pencil. Celeste stood and walked to the far wall where a map of the county hung tacked and faded with red dots she had added, marking the origins of most of the juveniles sentenced in Givens's courtroom. Rashad's neighborhood was already crowded with pins. "They always come from the same corners," she said aloud, not to anyone in particular, but as if saying it made it harder to ignore. She thought back to the expression on Judge Givens' face. In the video, she'd shown him the look he gave the boy in the recording, the one that didn't just see guilt, but invisibility, like the child didn't matter until he broke something. The silence in the room deepened. The only sound came from the low hum of the heater kicking on, warming the air, but not the atmosphere. Celeste returned to her desk, her motions smooth, but weighed down by the truth she'd just laid bare. She opened her laptop, pulled up the draft report, and began adding a section labeled "Judicial Bias in Language." She copied the phrase exactly as it had been recorded, bolded it, and wrote beneath it, "This was not a legal judgment. This was a personal verdict disguised as policy." Then she opened a second document and began drafting a formal request for case reconsideration. She didn't rush. She knew every word mattered. She included the details the court had ignored: family history, living conditions, school attendance, nutrition reports from the county clinic, and she built a picture not of a case but of a life. A boy, a name, someone who hadn't been given a second chance because no one had looked far enough to know he deserved a first one. By the time she finished, the sky had turned a dusky purple outside the window, and the city lights had begun to blink on one by one. She closed the file gently, pressing her palm to the cover like she was sealing something that needed protecting. Then she placed it beside the others in a box labeled Priority Review, Action Pending. Her back ached as she stood her body, reminding her of the hours she'd spent hunched over truth that too many people wanted to forget. As she turned off the lamp, the room was bathed in a gentle half-dark, the kind of light that made everything seem softer than it was. But nothing about what she was doing was soft. It was hard, necessary, long overdue, and tomorrow that file would no longer just sit on her desk. It would move into courtrooms, into hands that had to answer, into the very heart of a system that had forgotten what justice was supposed to mean. And as she locked the door behind her and stepped out into the cool evening, she didn't feel triumphant. She felt resolute, because Rashad's story wasn't the only one. It was just the one that finally made silence impossible. The room was colder than expected, not because the temperature had dropped, but because the air carried a kind of tension that no thermostat could fix. The hearing chamber was filled with rows of high-backed wooden benches, the kind that forced people to sit straighter than they were comfortable with, as if posture alone could give them dignity. At the front, a long rectangular table had been set up facing the panel, 3 oversight officials from the state, 2 silent aides behind them, and a recorder who never looked up from her keyboard. Behind them, 2 flags hung stiff and unmoving, while a simple microphone at the center of the table marked where voices would either be heard or buried. Celeste Monroe entered just after 9, her steps deliberate, the sound of her heels lost beneath the low hum of whispers and rustling papers. She wore the same suit she had worn to courtroom 4C, but today it looked different, firmer, somehow like the fabric had absorbed her resolve. She carried a leather folder tucked beneath one arm, her other hand resting calmly at her side, the gesture so relaxed it almost masked the weight of what she was about to do. She didn't look around the room for support. She didn't scan for allies. She had learned long ago that justice doesn't always come with applause. Judge Harlan Givens was already seated at the far end of the room, his expression unreadable, eyes trained on the table like he was waiting for it to offer him a script. He didn't look at her as she passed, didn't blink, didn't fidget, but his fingers tapped once barely audible against the edge of his folder, a sound too quiet for most people to catch but loud enough for Celeste. She took her seat, placed the folder down in front of her, and exhaled once slowly, letting the breath settle the space between her shoulders and spine. A man in a navy suit at the center of the panel cleared his throat and leaned slightly forward. "Miss Monroe," he began, "you've requested this hearing under Article 7, Section C, as an emergency review. Is that correct?" Celeste nodded. "It is," she said, her voice even not loud but firm enough to make people listen. "I'm presenting a formal petition for the reconsideration of sentencing in the case of Rashad Bennett and a review of judicial conduct involving multiple similar cases presided over by Judge Givens." The panel didn't move. No one spoke. The man simply gestured with an open palm. "Proceed." Celeste opened her folder and began. She didn't read from a prepared speech. She didn't rely on legal jargon or dramatic pauses. She told the story case by case, pattern by pattern, life by life. She named each child, detailed the charges, the context, the ignored facts, the sentencing language. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The facts laid side by side told a story more devastating than emotion ever could. She paused, only once turning a page more slowly than the others. "In Rashad Bennett's case," she said, eyes now resting on the panel, "we see a sentence that lacks proportionality, compassion, and legal grounding. He was 15. He was hungry. The court treated him like a threat, not a child." She held up the hearing transcript, the words "repeat in the making" underlined in red. This language was not legal. It was personal, and it reveals a pattern of assumptions that directly shaped the outcome of his life. At that, Givens finally shifted, just slightly, a glance downward, a twitch of his jaw, the tightening of his shoulders. Celeste didn't look at him. She kept her focus on the panel. "Bias in the courtroom doesn't always come dressed in slurs or shouting," she said. "Sometimes it shows up in what's omitted, what questions aren't asked, what stories aren't heard, what sentences are handed down like routine instead of reflection. The panel asked a few follow-up questions, mostly for clarification. Celeste answered them all clearly, with no defensiveness, no hedging. She offered data affidavits, policy gaps. She backed it all with names, timestamps, records that had been filed, overlooked, and forgotten until now. By the time she closed the folder, the room had gone entirely still. Even the aides had stopped typing. "Thank you, Miss Monroe," the man at the center said. "We'll move into committee review." Celeste nodded once, then stood gathering her folder without rush, without flourish. As she turned to leave, her eyes passed briefly over Givens. He didn't meet her gaze. His hands were clasped, now knuckles, pale, mouth tight, but it wasn't fear. She saw it was something quieter, something older. The look of a man who had never thought the rules would apply to him. Until now. Outside the hearing room, the hallway was quiet. A few reporters lingered near the doors, pens in hand, but none approached. They just watched as Celeste walked past, the air around her, neither triumphant nor defeated but resolute. One of the reporters scribbled something on her notepad. Another raised a phone and snapped a quick photo. Celeste didn't stop. She kept moving forward, each step carrying the quiet strength of someone who had decided long ago that truth didn't need permission to enter a room, it only needed a way in. At the end of the hall, a young intern stood waiting with a sealed envelope marked "Confidential Panel Review." She handed it over without a word. Celeste thanked her gently and continued on, her mind already moving forward, her focus already shifting to the next step in a process that didn't end with hearings or headlines. Because this wasn't just about one boy. It wasn't even just about one judge. It was about who gets believed and who gets dismissed, about who gets punished and who gets protected, about the quiet architecture of power that lives in courtrooms, in language, in the moment a gavel hits wood. And as Celeste stepped out into the soft light of the late morning, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a witness who refused to look away, and maybe, just maybe, someone who had made it harder for everyone else to keep doing so. The office door clicked shut behind him with a softness that didn't match the weight in Judge Givens' chest, and for a long moment he just stood there in the stillness, one hand still resting on the brass handle, as if unsure whether to turn back or keep moving forward. The room was small, smaller than his chambers, smaller than the courtroom, and yet somehow it felt larger now, like the silence inside had expanded to fill every inch, crowding out the usual comfort of solitude. His robe was folded over one arm, not draped with the dignity it once carried, but tucked awkwardly like something he wasn't sure he still had the right to wear. He placed it on the back of the chair, not carefully, just mechanically, and sat down at the edge of the desk, as if he didn't quite trust the chair to hold him. The folder they'd given him was slim but not light. Inside, a single-page summary of findings, clinical in tone, each line stripped of emotion but not impact. Pattern of judicial inconsistency, disproportionate sentencing, documented language indicating bias. The words blurred slightly at the edges as he stared at them, not from tears but from the slow realization that he no longer recognized the man being described, not fully, not entirely, but enough to know they weren't wrong. He rubbed at his temple the way he used to when he'd been up all night prepping trial notes. Only this time there was nothing to prepare for, no arguments to be made, no chambers to retreat, to no bailiff waiting outside to escort him back to order. A knock came, soft and hesitant, and before he could answer, the door cracked open just wide enough for a clerk to slide in a fresh folder, this one labeled "Judicial Resignation, Immediate Effect." The clerk didn't speak, didn't meet his eyes, just placed it on the desk and walked out the way one leaves a hospital room after delivering bad news. Givens stared at the folder, then let his gaze drift to the corner of the room where an old certificate still hung slightly crooked on the wall, a Bar Association award from nearly 20 years ago. He'd never bothered to straighten it, but suddenly the tilt looked accusatory. His phone buzzed on the desk, a number he recognized, Senator Trask. For a second he almost didn't pick it up, but reflex was hard to kill. "Ray," he said quietly, not quite a greeting. The voice on the other end was clipped, practiced. "I heard." Givens didn't answer. "There's nothing I can do," Trask added. "She's got evidence support from the Oversight Board and public momentum." Givens nodded slowly, even though no one could see. "So I take the fall alone." There was a pause. "You built this alone," Trask said, not unkindly, just plainly. Best you can do now is leave quietly, and then the line went dead. He sat for another long minute, the quiet pressing in around him like insulation, muffling the sound of distant office doors, opening and closing of papers, shuffling of a world already moving on without him. Then he reached for the resignation folder, opened it, and picked up the pen. His signature didn't shake, but something in his chest did. Not fear, not regret, something deeper, like the quiet collapse of a story he'd told himself for far too long, the one where he was always the reasonable one, the firm hand, the man doing what needed to be done. He stood slipping the signed document into the envelope and tucking it under one arm. No speech, no ceremony, just a final walk down a hallway where every face he passed looked away just a little too quickly, or smiled just a little too tightly. The elevator was slow, older than the rest of the building, and as it carried him down to the lobby, he watched his reflection in the metal doors. Creased forehead, drawn mouth, eyes that had once inspired fear, now only reflecting fatigue. When the doors opened, he stepped out into a space that had always felt like his domain, but now felt like it belonged to someone else. Outside, the sidewalk was bathed in soft afternoon light. No cameras, no reporters, just the distant sound of traffic and the occasional shuffle of footsteps against concrete. A few courthouse employees stood near the steps, murmuring in low voices that stopped as he approached. No one said anything. No one needed to. His briefcase, once an emblem of order, now dragged slightly behind him as he descended the steps one slow foot at a time, like a man walking not toward freedom but away from authority. He didn't look back. Not once. The doors didn't slam behind him. The wind didn't rise. The world didn't stop. But somewhere deep in the stillness of that quiet departure, something shifted, not just for him, but for the courthouse he left behind, and for the people who had once believed that justice only came in hard tones and quick rulings, because the bench hadn't moved but the ground beneath it had. And for the first time in decades, Judge Harlan Givens walked away not because he wanted to, but because someone finally made him answer for the weight of the silence he had long mistaken for control. It started with a shaky phone held low in someone's lap, the camera angled just enough to catch the scene without being obvious, the kind of quiet recording someone makes when they know no one in power will listen unless there's proof. The video was short, just under 2 minutes, but it held everything: the soundless tension of courtroom 4C, the low murmur of shuffling papers, the click of a pen against a notebook, and then the voice of Judge Givens cutting through the air like a blade. "This isn't a protest," he'd said. "This is a courtroom." The camera didn't move when he pointed toward the gallery, but you could feel it. Everyone in that room had turned toward her. Then there was Celeste, rising slowly, calmly, no dramatic exit, no raised voice, just a woman closing her notebook, nodding once, and walking away as if she knew she was leaving behind something louder than any objection ever filed. The clip didn't have captions, didn't need commentary, didn't even carry the sound of applause or outcry. It carried something better: stillness that spoke. By noon the next day it had been shared over 100,000 times. By nightfall the number had tripled, and by the end of the week it wasn't just a video, it was a signal. People didn't share it because they were outraged. They shared it because they recognized something in the silence, something they had felt but never seen, captured so clearly. A nurse commented, "I've been dismissed in courtrooms for wearing scrubs and not a suit. This made me feel seen." A teacher wrote, "I've watched students disappear behind files and assumptions. This woman stood for them all." And beneath the most viewed version of the clip, pinned at the top, was a comment that simply read, "She didn't shout, she stood, and it was louder than any protest I've ever seen." The name attached to that comment was Marcus Loy, a man recently exonerated after serving 12 years for a conviction handed down in Givens's courtroom. Celeste didn't respond to the messages, didn't post a follow-up, didn't step in to explain herself. She didn't need to. Her silence had already said enough. But what followed wasn't noise. It was momentum. More people came forward. Former defendants, quiet court clerks, public defenders, who had long stopped believing anyone was listening. They spoke not with bitterness, but with clarity, with stories that mirrored Rashad's in all the worst ways. And suddenly, the system that had moved with such quiet impunity found itself caught in the light of public memory. Podcasts picked up the story. Editorials ran side-by-side comparisons of Givens' rulings against statewide averages. Legal scholars analyzed the language used in his judgments, noting the patterns, the assumptions, the recurring phrasing that had once passed unnoticed, but now rang out with chilling consistency. But through it all, Celeste remained out of frame. Her presence felt more in absence than visibility. She didn't seek the spotlight. She had aimed for something far more difficult, the shift beneath it. Inside courthouses around the state, things began to change, not with sweeping reforms or televised pledges, but in smaller, quieter ways. Judges took longer with their rulings. Public defenders pushed back harder. Clerks whispered reminders to each other about transcripts and record integrity. And in waiting rooms and hallways and jury pools, people started looking up and asking, "Is someone watching this?" Not with fear, but with hope. Back in her office, Celeste watched it all unfold from a distance, not detached but centered. She kept working. She reviewed more cases. She followed up on the panel's recommendations. But every once in a while she'd get an envelope in the mail or a message forwarded from someone in another district, an assistant principal, a retired court reporter, a 17-year-old girl who'd seen the video and decided to attend her first city council meeting. And each time Celeste would read the words slowly, quietly, and then place the message in a small wooden box on her shelf, marked simply with the word "witnessed." She didn't need their thanks. She needed the work to continue. And as the video faded from headlines and the world moved forward, the ripples it left behind kept spreading in classrooms and courthouses, in the spaces where silence had once been mistaken for safety. Because what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about a judge or a sentence or a single boy with a bag of soup. It was about the quiet truth that dignity, when practiced fully, becomes contagious. And maybe Celeste thought one evening as she watched the sky turn from orange to slate, maybe justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it enters the room, sits down in the third row, and waits for the world to notice that someone finally refused to leave quietly. The courthouse steps had never looked so quiet. No cameras, no flashing badges, no crowds holding banners or reporters shouting for comment, just the soft murmur of conversation and the shuffle of everyday shoes against aging concrete. Sunlight poured down in long slanted lines, catching the dust in the air and making it shimmer like something holy, though no one said it out loud. Celeste stood at the top of the steps for a long moment, her hand still loosely holding the railing, her body facing forward, but her eyes tracing a memory. The courthouse doors behind her clicked shut, softly sealing off the echoes of what had just happened. A final review hearing, signatures delivered, systems acknowledged, and something quietly closed. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying either. Her expression was the kind that came after something real, not pride, not sorrow, but release. Her shoulders had dropped slightly, her breath deeper now, like the body, remembering how to relax after years of staying braced for impact. She didn't look back at the doors behind her. She'd spent enough time walking into rooms that weren't ready for her, sitting in silence that wasn't hers to explain, standing her ground while others reshaped it beneath her. This moment wasn't about reflection. It was about continuation, about walking forward, without waiting for the world to understand why you had to begin alone. At the bottom of the steps, a small cluster of people had gathered, no signs, no chants, just presence. A woman in a faded yellow scarf stood with her arms crossed gently over her chest, eyes misty, watching in quiet reverence. A man in a maintenance uniform stood beside her, nodding once, as if to say, "We saw." Beside them, a child, maybe 6 or 7, held a juice box in one hand and her mother's fingers in the other, her big eyes fixed entirely on Celeste. She didn't look away, didn't hide behind her mother's coat, didn't fidget like most kids her age might. She just stared with the kind of raw, wordless curiosity that only children carry, like she was watching someone step out of a story she hadn't been told yet. As Celeste descended the steps, her footsteps light but deliberate, the girl leaned up and whispered something to her mother. The woman didn't hush her. She bent down slowly, tucked a loose curl behind her daughter's ear, and whispered back, just loud enough for Celeste to catch the words. "No, baby," she said. "She's not the judge. She's the one who makes the judges think twice." Celeste almost paused, then not from surprise, but from the quiet accuracy of it, from the way a sentence so simple could hold the weight of years. But she didn't stop. She let it land and kept walking steady, graceful past the crowd into the sunlight that waited like something earned. Behind her, the building stood unchanged, Same doors, same steps, same stone, but something was different now, even if only the people felt it. Inside, someone would eventually remove Judge Givens's nameplate store, his files clear the bench. There would be another name, another robe, another voice. But the room would remember. Spaces always do. They remember who sat still when it mattered, who left quietly, and who stood so that others would know they didn't have to kneel again. Celeste crossed the plaza, her coat catching in the breeze, her shadow long behind her but never dragging. She didn't walk like someone finished. She walked like someone free, not because the work was done, but because the fear of doing it alone no longer followed her. She'd spent her life tracing the fault lines of systems people insisted weren't broken, gathering the quiet truths that others had dropped like scraps too small to keep. And now those truths had taken root in courtrooms, in minds, in children who whispered questions that used to go unspoken. As she turned down the sidewalk toward the street, a young man in a brown sweater nodded to her as he passed. "Thank you," he said, voice barely above a whisper, but anchored in something solid. Celeste met his eyes, returned the nod, and said only, "Keep asking questions." And she meant it not as a slogan, not as advice, but as a way forward. Because justice, she had learned, didn't arrive with trumpets or gavels. It arrived in fragments, in voices raised gently in presence, held firmly in decisions made when no one else was watching. And sometimes justice arrived not through the doors of a courtroom but in the stillness that followed when one person refused to walk out the way they were told. Celeste didn't look back again. She didn't need to. The building had heard her. The people had seen her. And the story, her story, was no longer hers alone. It belonged now to those who had watched, to those who had felt something shift, and to a little girl who years from now might still remember the moment she saw a woman walk down courthouse steps with nothing but grace and a silence loud enough to carry. What this story reminds us quietly but powerfully is that justice doesn't always look like a headline or sound like a shout. Sometimes it walks into a room with no fanfare, sits down in the back, and simply refuses to look away. It teaches us that dignity isn't loud, but it's strong. That silence, when held with purpose, can speak louder than any argument. And most of all, it reminds us that even in a world where systems seem too big to challenge, one steady voice, one unshaken presence, can make all the difference. For those of us who've lived long enough to know the weight of being overlooked, dismissed, or silenced, we understand the courage it takes not to raise your voice, but to stand your ground. Maybe you've been there yourself. Maybe you've seen it happen to someone you love. This story isn't just about a courtroom. It's about our communities, our choices, and the quiet power of showing up when it matters most. If this story moved you, even in a small way, we ask you to do one simple thing. Don't let it stop here. Like the video, share it with someone who still believes in what's right, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you stories that don't just pass through your screen but stay with your heart. Because stories like this aren't just entertainment, they're reminders. And sometimes a reminder is exactly what the world needs. Thank you for listening. And thank you truly for standing with those who stand alone.